can you tell me the story behind Carl Jung's last book, the Red Book?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I guess the story dates back to around 1912, and the relationship between Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, which most people are aware of who are interested in psychology, it plays a significant role, as up until that point, Jung had been an avid disciple, I could say, and friend of Sigmund Freud's. And by that point, the two had already found out that they have some differences within their opinions, especially around the nature of the unconscious. And Jung himself had started to feel that perhaps the unconscious could be, in fact, described as something that has a far more universal theme or origin, and not just something that is limited to the personal unconscious. And Freud, at that point, could not accept the sort of liberties that Jung was taking. He was looking forward to Jung becoming a sort of a prodigy of his and to continue his legacy. And the two had a very tumultuous break, and it was you could probably imagine it as like a like a breakup, but between two very good friends, because they were intellectual companions and spent a lot of time together, and in a sense shared what became to be the creation of the foundations for psychoanalysis. And so Jung went on to have a kind of a private breakdown. It was a time in which during in his life he became a little bit more isolated. Up until that point, he had been at the Berghaus hospital where he was working, and he started his private practice at his house in Zurich. And also during this time, Jung became, you could say, he started to have very profound visions that were somewhat disruptive also for his day-to-day life, and very intense dreams. And at the start of the Red Book, which actually was only published in 2009, as you said, it's the last book that he published, but not the last book he wrote, because it started already in 1912, this process. He describes that this was the creative period, which was the beginning for everything else, and all of his later works were actually drawn to some degree from this time period, which all in all lasted about 17 years. So it started with this breakdown or breakthrough, during which Jung really felt that he was, in a sense, descending into madness, and the images of the unconscious were really overcoming him during the days. He was kind of feeling a sense of desperation around how can he hold his private practice while also descending into deeper and deeper into the imagination.
Yeah, it's gone.
Yeah, so that was the beginning point of what are also known now as black books. So he started to write down everything in these journals. He actually began to work systematically with images of the unconscious, with these techniques that he had, in a sense, learned with his work with mediums, and also with somewhat taken from his work with schizophrenics, and that he began to practice a technique which later became known as active imagination. So he began systematically to descend into these hypnagogic states where he would encounter certain type of images, and he would write everything down. And for years and years, he kept these notebooks, and then later he transcribed everything into what is today known as the Red Book, which is this amazing and very finely illustrated magnum opus, and very unusual piece of literature. It's a very big book. The original copy is probably somewhere in Switzerland to this day, and it's done with Latin and German calligraphy, and it's also accompanied by these very beautiful illustrations that Jung himself also did. So all in all, the whole process took many, many years, and he kept the book in a vault. Well, actually, I guess his family put it in the vault after his death, but he did not want it to be published during his lifetime. And then it was only in 2000 early 2000, when the family decided that this should be also something that is known to people who are familiar with Jung's work and want to understand him deeper. So Sonu Shamdasani began to work on the book, and then the copy became available in English for public in 2009.
So he did want it to be released, but only after his death, or was he kind of more ambivalent and he didn't really know whether it would see the light of day?
There aren't really any, as far as I know, there aren't any direct references from him whether he wanted it published or not. So I imagine that he presumed that it might pique people's interest to a degree, that it might become public at some point. But I think he knew that it would have been too controversial in his day. It would have put his psychology into a very different light, which I think he didn't want at that point.
But it's fascinating that he started writing these books around the breakup with Freud, and he's then developing new ideas from Freud, but I suppose as well he's learned so much from Freud, and his work is not completely different from Freud. Like, he's still aligned with many traditional psychologists, and yet it's also must be difficult for him because he's having these visions. The way you describe it, sometimes feels he can't stop them, and he's realizing there's something different to the way he's seeing the world, and even religious visionary aspects to psychology. It's not just something that's formulaic or reducible to base instincts that perhaps Freud wants to do, and so it helps me contextualize what it was like for Jung at this time as he breaks up with Freud.
Yeah, you make a good point, and I do think that they shared a lot of interest in just, they both wanted to understand the unconscious, and they were both immensely interested in dreams, and that in itself is just a huge shared avenue of research. But I think Jung was always willing to go far deeper. At that point he had already started his deep exploration of mythology and religion, and sort of the kind of the deep dive into different types of historical and religious traditions that may help to explain how unconscious operates. He was also really interested in magic, and Freud really warned against that. But the thing is that there are actually there are notes also that Freud had an interest in occultism, but he really didn't want it to come out to the surface either, because he felt that, again, his reputation could be endangered. And I think here we also have to remember the cultural climate of the early 20th century, which was obviously somewhat still kind of, you could describe it as rationalism was as a virtue that was highly valued, and it was still developing these different types of scientific methodologies, and psychology as a science was really at its infancy. I mean, this was already before behaviorism or any of this type of things even came to take place. And there was a really strong urge to quantify and become a bit more methodological in regards to understanding human nature. So in that sense, I think whatever the kind of explorations that Jung ventured into Gnosticism and alchemy, they just really didn't fit the status quo. They were far too, unhinged for most people to really consider. And I think that's still the case today.
Yeah, both of them trying to hide a bit their more occult interests, and I also think kind of rigor is needed as well. So even if you explore the unconscious, you also want to still have the kind of methodological care to make sure, okay, is what I'm finding valuable, useful for science. I wonder if it's more acceptable today to have these kinds of interests, or do you think it's still kind of the case that if people have these kinds of, say, visions that Jung had, they don't want to talk about it.
I think we're at a really interesting point where so much of the what has been considered to be parapsychological phenomena and things that people haven't really even considered to be possible are actually becoming part of a normal discourse. And you can see that with a lot of, you could mention like very popular podcasts that have got millions and millions of listeners. They're suddenly talking about like extrasensory experiences or near-death experiences or psychedelics or any of these kinds of things that have been somewhat marginalized. So I really do think that there are frontiers in science that are completely undiscovered. And I think Jung had a hunch about that. And obviously he's worked with Wolfgang Pauli on synchronicities a little bit later, around 1930s, was a reach, an attempt to actually put some kind of framing onto what is the phenomena of synchronicity, and could we actually try to already then start to bridge this gap between physics and psychology. And while it didn't necessarily become, again, part of the mainstream science as Jung would have wanted, I think it started that whole discussion, which has been going on for nearly 100 years now. So I think in so many ways we're all the time breaking those taboos, and we're having more and more of those kinds of conversations of like what is consciousness, and how can we understand our relationship to our realities, and are we in what kind of dialogue are our minds with our external environment.
And you mentioned psychedelics there, more commonly talked about today. Do we know if Carl Jung ever did them or was interested in them or his views on them?
So I don't think so, and none of his writings suggest that he did. In fact, he was quite against the idea of using psychedelics for a few reasons. So in his correspondence with a theologian and a pastor, Victor White, he writes about LSD in a way that really doesn't suggest that he really understood what the substance is. But in that correspondence, he says something quite interesting, which is almost suggestive that he didn't think that humans really deserved to touch upon these. You could define it as a divine realms that we didn't really deserve to have that kind of shortcut. And ultimately, he said that we don't need any more material that naturally comes through to us through intuition and our dreams, and that these are the gateway to the unconscious, and that's basically it. And I guess if you think about him and think about Red Book, you can see why he would have thought that, because he was clearly somebody who had this amazing sensitivity and ability to traverse into in imagination in a way that is quite unusual. So I don't think he was necessarily somebody who needed psychedelics. He was so in tune, but also he worked for that attunement, because he would oftentimes go into isolation for extended periods of time. This was already, he died in 1960, so he would really go on for periods of time living in this tower in Bollingen where there was no electricity, no running water. So he was very much living close to the land, and living a very simplistic life with no distractions, the kind of existence that many people today could only dream of. So the way in which I see it is that Jung didn't really need necessarily the psychedelics himself, and he was maybe somewhat arrogant about the potential of them to help human consciousness. But there's something really interesting that I found during my research around this topic, which I think a lot of people don't really know about, which is that there is there is an anecdote in somebody else's book. It's this child psychologist called Michael Fordham who visited Jung right before his death, and it's just a few sentences that he writes about it. He basically says that he had gone to visit Jung, and this was already at the point when this was just a few days before his death, and that Jung was there, and he was kind of looking a bit deranged, and nothing that he was saying was making much sense. And he was saying, so Michael Fordham writes that Jung was talking about LSD and its ability to lower the threshold of consciousness. And Michael Fortman, who wasn't necessarily somebody who was pro psychedelics, says that this was just completely nonsensical, and clearly at that point he had already lost his ability to reason and to think clearly. So I think it's really interesting that few sentences about the days before Jung passed actually exists, even though it's not something that Jung himself wrote down, but it suggests that maybe right before he passed away, he died a few days later, he actually reconsidered the role of psychedelics, and maybe not even somebody like Jung, who had such a vision for psychology and human consciousness, could have actually foreseen the kind of reality in which we live now, some 80, 90 years later, where we are constantly bombarded by information technology, and we don't sort of, our psyches are not at rest in ways that they were before. So therefore, we just don't have the same kind of connection and access to our unconscious that I think people had back in the day. So that's that.
Yeah, that Carl Jung didn't need psychedelics, perhaps. He was almost even too connected to his unconscious. And then today, I suppose there's a lot of work on careful use of psychedelics can actually have dramatic improvements, and yes, you could say help us tap into our unconscious. And it reminds me of something I read from your work, that perhaps in more ancient societies they were more deeply embedded in collective unconscious and the kind of just a collectivity of the society more generally, such that maybe their dreams even and more unconscious activity made more sense to them, whereas to us it's a bit more foreign. And do we even look at our dreams or know how to make sense of them? And so we also then lose access to the ability to tap into the unconscious, to make sense of it. And
I mean, if you think about just Australian Aboriginals, I don't know if you know about this concept of Dreamtime, but it seems to be something that existed across all different tribes. Or, well, I want to say all, but I think nearly all different tribes that were actually physically disconnected from one another. They wouldn't have necessarily been able to meet. But there was this certain kind of understanding that dreaming was very much some kind of foundation for their religious life or spiritual life, if you may. And their understanding of how dreams could be used for insight, for learning, was so much more developed than ours. And to a point that, like, I don't think we can really understand how a civilization that would honor dreams that much could even function. I think we're very much still somehow in our infancy when it comes to understanding dreams.
I think as well, particularly in the West, we're very individualistic, which can have its benefits, but there's less scope we can have to change our lives or the lives of others sometimes, so that even if our dreams want us to change ourselves or society, there's less scope. I mean, I might be wrong in this, but it's just we live in very different times. So I wonder, however people did use their dreams, is there something like a kind of rediscovery needed in order to be able to use our dreams? And on one day, another thing. So you mentioned Carl Jung and his access to dreams and visions. It reminds me of Terence McKenna, who liked Jung, and I suppose he has the opposite view, that for him psychedelics was something where he liked them because of how it could smash you into deep realms of visions and imagery in the unconscious, and you didn't need to spend years as a meditation expert, go to temples in India, and so the normal person could kind of have access. And I guess it's, and again, I don't know if because he liked psychedelics to be very strong. He was quite the explorer and quite adventurous. So I don't know if he also would be the paragon of this is the example we should all have of how to use them. But I found it very interesting to contrast.
Yeah, I like that you brought in Terence McKenna. I recently had the opportunity to attend a very small Terence McKenna gathering. Shout out to anybody who is watching who was there, and it was an amazing opportunity to really um, go into Terence McKenna's life. And I also gave a talk about Terence McKenna's connection to Jung. And while I was doing my research for that, I really understood how deeply Jungian Terence is. I mean, he started reading Jung's works already when he was 14. He wanted to become a analyst, and it was just something that didn't happen in his life. But you could say, and to be honest, I've heard this from some of the people who were closest to Terence, that Jung was his first and foremost intellectual influence in his life. And I think, therefore, his entire understanding of what unconscious is, and how is this connected to our realities, is so deeply influenced by Jung. And at the same time, I think there were clearly limitations by which Terence encountered when he ventured into this hyperspace, or whatever he wants to call it. But there's also very interesting parallels. For instance, Terence himself discovered that the machine elves that he oftentimes refers to, and I know actually you've also talked about this with at least one of your guests in the podcast, actually have a kind of a parallel in Jung's work, where he talks about the alchemical kabiri, which are also known as this kind of mischievous spirits that want to sort of meddle with human affairs, but have their very much their own agenda and live kind of parallel existence to that of the humans. So I think when it comes to the DMT realms and realms that people can access when they do very heavy doses of psilocybin or ketamine, I guess there's a feel that you are in a different kind of space, and somewhat the Jung's, what we most often refer to as kind of like a symbolic realm and narrative, is perhaps a little bit limited. But I do think there's a lot that it offers regardless, because then when it comes to actually understanding and interpreting the experiences for yourself, thinking about those experiences even in a symbolic way can be extremely helpful and really bring a lot of insight. And there's also some very interesting research. Shout out to my friend Mackenzie Amara, who's done some amazing research on the continuation of psychedelic visions and dreams. So I think these are, again, realms that we really just don't understand, and how much do these psychedelic spaces are related to our dreams. It's something that hopefully future research will touch upon.
That is kind of a question I had almost, is how much very extreme psychedelic experiences where it's less you control it, right? There's almost autonomous entities and whatever their metaphysical nature is. Can they be beneficial? Can there be some sort of individual growth from those? And I suppose the answer you give there is a bit of towards the affirmative, that actually there's a way in which it's not kind of random, or you're not thrown into something which is completely foreign and unhelpful, but that there is some kind of help to you. But I kind of want to ask a bit more about that. I mean, what do you think if you have autonomous machine elves, and can these experiences, how do people deal with them? How is it like?
Well, I think it's so much of it depends on framing. And one of the ways in which Terence McKenna was thinking about them is that maybe somehow these machine elves would have been representations of the ancestors. So they were just these kind of, their physical appearances would have been something that we do not understand. But at the same time, maybe they are somehow, that's the shape that they would be taking in spirit realm. And then there's this sort of overlap when you go into the psychedelic space. Another suggestion that he had is that there is just so many different types of universes, and when you take a certain psychedelic, you just enter into a different kind of dimension, and you just meet these entities that are somehow, living their parallel existence. But going to your question about, like, how, I guess you were sort of asking how helpful these encounters can be. Well, humans are meaning making machines. Like, you make your own meaning. So I think it can be really hard to make meaning out of an experience that is so completely foreign and alien. And yet, I think that's also the one of the greatest things about being alive is that the universe is just this completely unfathomable mystery, and we're just starting to get a kind of a glimpse into how strange it is. And I love that about Terence McKenna's work, because he was just so open. He was just so open and receptive to that strangeness of these experiences. So it's like, maybe not everything is in service as we want to frame it as, like, for human growth and healing. I think it's very naive to think in those terms. But at the same time, I think there's enough reports from people who venture into these spaces that for whatever reason, these entities that you might encounter have a great interest in human affairs, and that they oftentimes seem to want to teach us something. They want to show us things. And I think all of that is in relation to, our collective evolution, and how we are finding new ways of being alive, and taking care of this earth, and being better humans.
Yeah, there's, on the one hand, sometimes foreign, strange experiences on psychedelics are not necessarily cultivated bespoke for your own good, because there's also mysteries, as you say, to the world. So you might encounter those things, and then you're going to have to try and make meaning out of those if that's something you decide to go into. On the other hand as well, I've talked to someone recently who's done DMT a lot and values it therapeutically. And for him, he finds it something very innate and familiar about it, the experience and how it feels. And it's also a very simple molecule. So it's, and I believe it's produced by our body. It's in a lot of plants. And so, perhaps, I guess it almost makes me feel like foreign aspects of the mind and experiences are also quite close to us in a way as well, because we can fall asleep each night, and if we take account of our dreams, they can be quite odd. And so it's like some of the deeper, weirder aspects of the world they're quite close, and they probably charge our lives with meaning normally. We just aren't aware of it. I'm speculating, but it's very interesting.
If I may, there's something that you just said that really brought something to my mind, which I would love to bring into discussion, which both Jung and Terence McKenna were really fascinated by. And funnily enough, I don't know, for those of you who know, Terence McKenna died of an illness at a relatively young age. I think he was 53 or something around that age. So I don't think he foresaw that whatever he was working on then would become his last work. But he became really interested in alchemy, and he spent quite some time in Bohemia. And one of the things that he was working on was this documentary film about John Dee that also explores this notion of coincidentia oppositorum, which is an alchemical concept that also Jung was really interested in. And funnily enough, Jung's last work is also known as Mysterium Connectionis, which also refers again to this coincidence of opposites, you could say. So in a sense, it's about how the polarities are always held together, and how you said, one of your friends had described that there's also such a profound sense of familiarity about these spaces, And what McKenna also mentions in one of his talks is that the the the, the craziness of the whole thing is that there is precisely that sense of familiarity that is paired with this complete alienness. And oftentimes when you think about, our human existence, oftentimes these two types of polarities come together. So we are almost always growing through that type of paradox. But I think that's something that is quite a foreign thing still in our Western culture to really try to understand or to balance. If you also think about shadow work or something like this, you're again, there's the paradox by thinking, bringing out certain kind of negative qualities within ourselves, as sort of certain type of attributes, we can actually really discover light within ourselves. So this this aspect of a paradox and a polarity is a really profound part of Jung's work that also McKenna was really interested in. And
it makes me gone.
And it's the basis for alchemy as well.
Yes, it makes me think that in our modern world, shadow work is something which is harder to do because we have to be more practical, pragmatic, and hold normal jobs, and there's something more bureaucratic about the world, and we have more formal institutions. So it's hard to showcase that and acknowledge your own dark side and more primal parts of yourself. But then probably also today there's the most value in that because you can share your work and you can share insights across the world and transforming yourself as a person and bridging those opposites, as you say, is something yet more valuable. And then the alchemy, I know Terence McKenna and Jung were interested in alchemy, and it's apparently something which kind of in sort of 1500s, and it's, tell me about it. How does the West kind of touch on these traditions?
Okay, well, I just want to say that I am by no means an alchemical expert of any sort. I do have an interest in it, and I've looked into it somewhat. But what I can speak to a little bit is Jung understanding and interpretation of alchemy. And what some of you may not know is that Jung was actually one of the primary interpreters of alchemy in our time. So he was somebody who put a lot of effort and initiative into publicizing and researching a lot of these alchemical texts and to kind of finding a coherent library. And Terence McKenna then obviously took from Jung's understanding of alchemy. So I guess one of the foundations of alchemy really is the process of transmutation. And there, if you think about it in psychological terms, as Jung did, which is also something that there's some controversy around that. Not everybody loves the fact that Jung psychologized alchemy, but that's a bit of a different topic. So there's a certain type of energy that is looking to be transmuted, and it can go through these different types of alchemical stages that oftentimes start with a crisis, and that is called nigredo in alchemy. And there's some kind of turbulence or a chaos point, which then gets turned around. So the point is that there's a certain amount of energy or a process that is turned into gold, alchemical gold. So I think it's a very beautiful metaphor just for how us humans, we move from different psychological states to the next, and also how change takes place, because it's like energy never gets destroyed. It's always just transmuted into something else. So I think in a sense, in modern times, alchemy can just bring a little bit more awareness that for especially in psychology and mental health, that a point of crisis is, it doesn't need to be always a bad thing. It can also be a catalyst for transformation. But that's something that we're still trying to get to grips with when it comes to traditional understanding of psychopathology, etc.
Yeah, I'm just gonna talk with a psychologist about the way in which the stability of the self is something that is constantly needs to be worked on and that perhaps more inherently we are parts and different tendencies and personalities and drives, and then it's really the challenge to bridge those together, to be a coherent person, and so maybe that's more the norm, that you are going to have instabilities, and he has a model whereby when people are in actually dissociative identity disorder, so in this kind of mental illness, actually, in order to get out of a kind of local minima where you have different parts and you've kind of separated them and they're not able to interact, talk with one another, that you actually need to descend into some disorder to kind of shake things up and to be able to have the opportunity to integrate those together. And it's actually only in having a bit more disorder that those could eventually be integrated and the person could become whole and well again. And I suppose you don't want just disorder, though. You want to have the appropriate scaffolding to integrate parts together. But very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. And it reminds me of something that Jung said about sort of mental illnesses of modern times, because one thing that he was really interested in was sort of how these frameworks of religious thought, if you look back in the even 100 years ago, most people would have had certain type of religious connotation and devotion, and that type of religiosity, it hasn't just vanished, it's just basically been transmuted into so many different types of forms, and that, and it has so many more expressions in these days than probably would have been in history, in more recent history. So the way in which I see it is that we're just always figuring out how sorry, just let me just come back to my my thought track. So he saw that mental illnesses could also be a kind of an expression of these ways in which certain type of religious figures would have been seen back in the day, and the kind of intensity with which people were dealing with them. I don't remember the exact part, unfortunately, in which he talks about this, but it goes somehow in a ways that, the spirituality of this day may be seen as mental illnesses of today. And I think there's something about that kind of intensity with which people are experiencing things today that have kind of been translated from our spiritual connectedness in the past. So I guess in a sense he just saw these as religious problems as well. And that's something that we've kind of taken out of the equation when it comes to modern psychology. We don't really think about things in terms of spirituality anymore. And I think a lot of mental illnesses are a system failure. They're a symptom of a society that doesn't work, and that we are just making them into being individual problems, whereas we have so many problems as a society.
And Carl Jung feels like someone emblematic of the kind of person who can integrate potentially strange, novel, societally thrown out visions, and yet he there's a world in which he doesn't successfully integrate all that, but now he kind of has, and actually we're talking about him perhaps more than ever in a way, and he's actually quite popular, and we're able to more think about these kinds of visionary experiences and dreams. And
I mean, I would say he is one of the most important intellectuals of our time and of the past century. I mean, his legacy is immense, and I think it's laughable how little he has been credited in psychology. I mean, this is something that I've heard from so many people who have studied psychology, that Carl Jung would have been mentioned once or twice. Like his legacy is has been completely disregarded. So I think it's really interesting that there's a kind of revival of his thought, and I think part of that is because his ideas are just immensely helpful when it comes to understanding really profound states of consciousness, such as the ones that are brought about by psychedelics. And while his experiences and his outlook and his work doesn't explain everything. I think it's really lovely to know that there are Western intellectual traditions, like such as Jungian psychology and archetypal psychology, that really have the space for those visionary experiences, for the human, more of the spiritual kind of quest, and the kind of almost like madness that resides in all of us. I think that was also part of what Jung was doing with the Red Book, is like he was getting into grips with his own madness and he was making something beautiful out of it. And he also advised other people to create their own Red Books, and because he believed that every person had this capacity to have this type of dialogue with their unconscious, and he believed that that was something really nourishing and important for our individuation journey.
Mm-hmm. Do you know if Carl Jung was a Christian? Would he have described himself so?
So he grew up in a Christian home. His father was a minister, but he had quite a distant relationship with his father. I do recall also having seen something that said that he also had multiple Christian ministers or pastors in his family history. But the kind of religiosity that his father had, Jung did not find attractive at all. He saw it as very stagnant and lifeless. So he became acquainted with Gnosticism quite early on in his life, and I think he also described himself as a Gnostic. There's a very interesting text from 1916, which also, again, wasn't published until it was found by one of Jung's students. It's called Seven Sermons to the Dead. And in this text, Jung basically writes under a pseudonym called Basilides, and it's essentially Sermon to the Dead, but the Basilides is a Gnostic heretic. So Jung had a great affinity towards the Gnostics because he felt that they had this understanding of the direct experience of the gnosis. So I think he saw his own life also being in the same lineage with the Gnostics, that whatever message he had to share with other people had similar kind of message as the ancient Gnostics would have had. But I don't know if he would have considered himself to be a Gnostic towards the later part of his life, because then he was more interested in the alchemist already. And I think there were certain things about Gnosticism that he also did not find resonance with. For instance, the idea that all of the material world is evil, etc.
I think it's interesting that he perhaps didn't want to abandon Christianity and religious roots, yet he also wanted to explore his own inner world, and he did want to bring in kind of inner experience. And I know from your essay, there was a really nice quote where it said that, was it Jung that said it? That faith lacked experience and science missed out on the soul. So there's a way in which he is a figure which can criticize typical religions, and yet he also criticizes science. And yet, you'd have to say he's religious, and you'd have to say he's a scientific person, because he's very spiritual, and he's very systematic as well, and rigorous, and so he's this kind of bridging figure, and wanting to go beyond both science and religion.
Yeah, I think he did, and he saw that psychology of the future, as you may say. I think he does write a little bit about this. I think he was just one of these people who had this amazing ability to bridge history and future in one, and I think he really foresaw something about the trajectory of psychology that most people at the time could have not digest in any way, because it was so futuristic. Maybe, I mean, I think he saw that the sort of the reality of our inner experiences was so huge. I mean, that was really Jung's form of religiosity, was his devotion to the inner images. And to understanding their symbolic value. And I think he knew somehow intuitively that at some point what he understood then was going to be more commonly understood, but the time for it was just not yet while he was alive.
Do you think he wanted to create his own religion? How different is it from religions of the past? How is he seeing himself connected backwards and sort of forwards into the future?
Yeah, I don't think he wanted to create his own religion necessarily. I know there's some critiques that are saying, I think he had a lot of inflated visions that I also described in the Red Book. For instance, in one vision, he's being crucified at a cross. So I guess you can say to anyone who is having that kind of vision that, they're having somewhat of an inflated experience. But then when you think about all the people who have a psychedelic experience where they think they're Jesus Christ, it's not an insignificant number. I mean, these types of experiences happen to people. And I think what they say is more that I think in some ways that is the kind of realization or the manifestation of the divine spark within people. And I think there again comes the connection with Gnosticism. And I think he wanted people to understand that they had access to this type of relationship that could also be a guiding force in one's life. I think it's much, much more like an kind of inner spirituality rather than like, Carl Jung led cult. Yeah, that's my interpretation of it anyways.
This has been really great. And before we end, where can people find you? Tell me about your work.
So I'm currently working on some research. I'm part of a study that investigates the effects of ketamine for alcohol addiction. So I don't have much of a kind of public persona online at the moment, but if you want to find me, I'm on LinkedIn. I'll put in the code, and I also do one-to-one work for psychedelic integration and prep, as well as mentorship that is Jungian-informed. So if somebody is interested in finding out more about that work, I have a website called individuationportal.com, and that's where you can find me as of now.
That sounds kind of enjoyable. I almost want to do it myself.
Yeah, why not?
Thank you, Johanna.
Yes, it's been great. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I look forward to following your work as well and seeing where your podcast and your PhD go next.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.